right after October 7th, the CJN really had a challenge of how we were going to cover what we knew was going to be the most important story, likely of our journalistic careers. And we think about what are the stories that we uniquely can tell. We have strong and deep ties and relationships in the community. We can go to the same event that everyone else, all the mainstream media will cover, but we will cover it differently. We'll cover it smarter because we have an understanding of the context and the nuance of the communities that we've worked in. My name is Lila Sarek, and I'm the news editor at the Canadian Jewish News. The CJN wants to continue to cover important stories across the country and important stories in Israel as well. And we can only do it with your help. Visit thecjn.ca/donate to support our work. And if you live in Canada, you will also receive a Canadian tax receipt. Thank you.
How I laid this out is it's really dealing with gaslighting. Use these arguments that many on the far left use against Jews, against Zionism, and turn it back onto them.
Shalom and welcome to Rivkush, the CJN podcast with Jews of color talking about anything Jewish.
It's time we talk about more than just the tragedy, the hardships we've overcome and the savagery. It's time we focus on what's woven in the tapestry, the roots that connect us to our truth and the canopy of every single branch.
Today, my guest, I'm so happy, Dmitri Shufutinsky. He is a junior research fellow with the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism Policy and is also a freelance journalist. He has been published in such publications as The Forward, Jerusalem Post, Jewish News Syndicate, Times of Israel, and a host of other publications. He also holds an MA in International Peace and Conflict Resolution. And another thing about him that's kind of super cool, he was a lone soldier with the IDF for 2 years. Do you mind if I ask you, because I follow you, like I was following you loosely on, social media, but I know you weren't, if I can remember, there wasn't a lot of posting of stuff, of course, when you were serving. And I just want to get a sense of why. What made you decide to do that? Because it's a very big, bold decision.
Right. So this is going to sound maybe a little cliche for some people, but my first trip to Israel ever was with Birthright. I was a senior in college, and I actually extended my stay by 8 days. I had a friend out there who was going to college and living with her uncle who lives there, so I stayed with her. And I just really fell in love with it and felt such a deep connection to the history and the roots that we have as Jews in the land, and particularly the segment of the trip where IDF soldiers joined us and we went to Mount Herzl, the cemetery, really spoke to me. So I came home with that, just feeling really inspired, having this idea that I wanted to go to Israel, and I ended up getting into my master's program at Arcadia University here in Philly, which is where I graduated college as well. So during that time in my master's program, I took 2 more years of Hebrew classes. My Hebrew is very rusty, even though I went to Jewish school.
Look, your rusty Hebrew is going to be 1,000 times better than my pathetic Hebrew that I'm studying every week. Okay, so don't even.
So after I finished my my master's program, I went into a program called Green Sabar. So basically the idea is you go through a number of seminars to see if you're a good fit. And it's for lone soldiers who go move to a kibbutz together, learn more Hebrew, deal with all the bureaucracy, really get to know the country, and then draft into the army, and you have a host family and everything there. But 2 years after Birthright, when I was still in grad school, I had an internship in Cyprus, which is like a 45-minute flight from Israel. So when the internship was over, I flew back. I actually met up with one of the soldiers from my Birthright trip. And I was in Israel for 2 weeks, kind of seeing if I still felt like this was something I wanted to do, if I still felt that connection. And I did. So that's when I made the decision.
Okay, I'm going to tell you something that is not cliche. Okay. I don't know why you think it would be. It is totally not. It's actually quite a cool journey. And I hear what you say. I always said to myself, if I was younger, I probably, not even I would have definitely volunteered, because I think it's important to be part of the people who protect the land and the people. I think it's really important. And it does give you a different perspective of Israel and
Yes.
a deeper connection, right? You
Hmm.
know, it's one thing that we all sitting in North America with our connection perceived or real to Israel. And it's another thing to actually live it, tangible connection, and do something about it. So thank you. So now let's talk about this. This caught my eye as soon as I saw, the message about your first book. I was like, dang. And then when I saw the title, I did a double dang. I literally, as soon as I saw it on social media, I went right and ordered it straight away, like straight away. So,
Thank
like, well done. I highly recommend this book. And so I don't want to give away any secrets, because people should buy the book as opposed to, listening to us talk about it. But I do have questions. First of all, so what made you, like, why? It's timely for sure, but why?
Yeah, I actually wrote this before October 7th. The whole thing, it
Okay.
was all finished
The
before
whole
then.
thing.
And then so eventually I did have to go back and add in some mentions of October 7th in the book because of what was going on. I actually was inspired to write it, though, after the previous big conflict in Gaza in 2021, because
Ah,
I had noticed this growth in the campus anti-Semitism after the 2014 war. But after the 2021 war, it just seemed, not just on campus, but on social media and in activist spaces, it seemed to have grown even more. So after that war, I began writing the book, but I had to put it aside for a little bit. I mean, just with, being in the army and eventually moving here, looking for work and all that sort of stuff, all of that kind of began to take some of my time. Gradually, I returned to it, and especially as I started working, with freelance journalism and research and looking into more of these kinds of cases and incidents, I said, okay, something needs to be done. And I I wrote the book as sort of like a what to expect when you're expecting kind of guide, because I feel like a lot of younger students who may be juniors or seniors in high school, or maybe even younger than that, may have heard about campus anti-Semitism, but don't know the specifics. They don't know what is this kind of anti-Semitism, where did all these
mhm.
ideas come from, or how to fight it. Because at least in the US, and I would think in some other countries too, um, the mainstream Jewish organizations historically have prepared us to deal with the kind of neo-Nazi, white supremacist,
Mhm.
radical Christian kind of anti-Semitism on the right wing, which obviously we need to know how to combat. But for the most part, this is not what we're seeing on college campuses. This is very radical left wing anti-Semitism with roots in Marxism. Now you're seeing a lot of it with roots in radical Islam as well, kind of merging together. And that also spoke to me because, my dad's side of the family is from the Soviet Union. So
Okay.
that kind of anti-Semitism is quite familiar to me. And a lot of Jews in this country, they have family that fled the pogroms or fled from the Holocaust, but maybe are less familiar with that strain. And so I said, okay, we have to explain what this is and where it comes from, and we have to outline a strategy for how to deal with it. And also, for a lot of people who are in mainstream organizations, who are in advocacy spaces, um, but may also feel unfamiliar with it, as well as with people already on campus, they need kind of a guide and a strategy for how to approach this. And so I decided to write the book, and the book outlines for people, okay, what is this argument, that is being used? It's a series of arguments, but what are the arguments being used by these kind of radical left-wing groups? Where did they originate? What have more mainstream Jewish or pro-Israel groups been doing wrong in terms of fighting it? Why is that not working? And what is the path forward for us? So that's kind of how
Wow.
the book is laid out.
Wow. I really find it quite telling when you also, because just, anecdotally, you're right. The focus has been on the kind of the KKK and all that neo-Nazism is that's the enemy, and they're the blatant, whether it's anti-Semitism or racism for that matter. And I remember saying, I used to be a real big social media nut, especially Twitter back in the day. Like, I remember one time I would wake up in the middle of the night to respond to tweets. I was like kind of out of control. So I've dialed it back a lot. But I would say to people on there wasn't, I'd say, oh my God, the racism that I'm facing and the this and that. And they say, oh yeah, those right way. And I said, actually, it's not. And people would be like, what do you mean? I said, it's not. I said, when I am having a discussion with somebody, and if they are left wing, I said, those are the conversations that quickly devolve into racist comments and stuff. I said, it's actually quite gobsmacking because that's not what we were taught to believe. We were taught to believe that that's the side that embraces all and that's, holds everything on high, right? That's what we've been taught. And now the world is waking up to that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
Right? Right?
Yeah. And it's very disturbing. I mean, it can feel very lonely at times, as somebody. I'm Black, I'm Jewish, and I'm gay. So all those things together, it's like you're getting it from all sides.
Oh, yeah. Like you can't catch a break.
Then there's all the gaslighting that comes with it, especially when you bring up these conversations with bigotry on the left. All this gaslight, and that makes it even worse. But I took that feeling of loneliness and quite frankly rage, and I said I have to channel it into something. Like, this is something that has to be addressed.
Yeah. I'm so glad you did. So what I also want to ask, because it's also your preface, the title, what does that mean? What is Jew Jitsu?
So I thought of the Jew Jitsu martial art, and the basic concept is you use the power of your opponent against them, and whether that's exhausting them and then you get the upper hand, or if they're coming at you, you just kind of move over, maybe you're a little more swift and they end up being the one on the ground.
Yeah.
So how I laid this out is it's really dealing with gaslighting. Use these arguments that many on the far left use against Jews, against Zionism, and turn it back onto them, because it'll do one of two things. It'll enlighten those who genuinely have no knowledge of what's going on over there in the land with the conflict and the history, and who might be kind of on the verge of being brainwashed into this. And it'll also show just the blatant hypocrisy and bigotry of those kind of leading this movement. So one example of this is this discussion of settler colonialism.
Oh.
Right. Yeah, that was my first chapter. So
oh, I know. It was like, oh. Anyways, go ahead.
So I said, let's start right there. And I've noticed that when the argument of settler colonialism in Israel comes up, a lot of Jewish activists who are well-meaning would rather sidestep the discussion or make some kind of argument along the lines of, well, Israel's there now, let's find a way to make peace. Or, oh, both peoples are native to the land. And I'm like, no, because peace has to be based on the truth. And if you look at the historical record, if you look at the archaeology, or if you want to, a progressive talking point, we believe in science. Let's look at the science and DNA testing. We are from the land. And if we want to talk about settler colonialism, we have to talk about the Arab conquest, because the Arabs were not living in what is now Israel or even the West Bank. They were not living in Syria or Iraq or North Africa prior to about 7 centuries ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we know how they arrived there. They came from the Arabian Peninsula. They took over the Fertile Crescent, North Africa. There were people living there, Jews, Kurds, Assyrians, Black people, Berbers, who were either enslaved, murdered, forcibly converted, you name it. And so I said, if you want to bring up the argument, let's actually address it head on. Now, does that mean that, all people there who are not the native peoples of those lands prior to the conquest, does that mean they have to leave or they're all bad? No, of course it doesn't. But peace can only be based in truth.
Absolutely.
And so that's where we have to start. We have to start by saying, if we're going to have this discussion of indigeneity and settler colonialism, the truth is the Jews are the natives to the land.
Yeah.
And the Palestinians are descended from colonizers.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is a conversation that needs to happen. And I so agree with you. The foundation has to be truth and take it from there. And I'm always like, it's just like people, it's a sad commentary actually on our institutions, our academic institutions, that is actually just history. That's something you should have been learning in school. I learned it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, how did you not know this? And how can you not be honest to say that Arabs were huge colonizers? That's what they did. Why are we pretending it doesn't exist?
Well, I think part of the problem is a lot of our academic institutions have become overwhelmingly dominated by progressives. There's not enough balance. And unfortunately, the progressive worldview tends to look at every ill as being something that came from the West, and will focus on colonization as something that only happened in Europe or Eurocentric
Right.
spheres, which first of all is hypocritical in and of itself, because a lot of these scholars who think that way will say, well, we need to stop being so Eurocentric. But then when they talk about colonialism, they only talk about it
Right there
from Europe.
Yeah.
There's no mention of not just the Arab conquests, but there's little to no talk of the Japanese Empire and what they did in Korea, or the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly.
There's no discussion of any kind of settler colonialism that happened by non-white groups.
Yeah.
So because of that, just using that term, I think throughout the years, colonialism is automatically just conflated with white people, with Europe. And so that's where I think this thing suddenly seems for some people like, oh my gosh, this should have been obvious, but why didn't we think of it that way?
My name is Michael Fraiman. I am the director of the Canadian Jewish News Podcast Network. When we first started podcasting at the Canadian Jewish News, we had to use the boardroom, and there was this wall of huge hardcover tomes filled with back issues of the CJN print edition, the old weekly paper dating back to the 60s and 70s. And because our microphone setup was not what you would call professional, my co-host and I had to prop up our microphones on these giant books, these tomes. We were literally recording on top of history. Today, the CGN Podcast Network has around a dozen shows. We're at 2 million downloads all time. Like everything we produce at the CJN, our podcasts are totally free. There's no paywall. You can listen to everything for free forever. But we do rely on the community to keep us going. And you can help. Please visit thecjn.ca/donate to make a tax-deductible donation.
The other topic that you touch on in your book, which strikes a chord with me, and I'll, if you don't mind me just like kind of elaborating from my perspective, is apartheid. So I'll tell you a little bit about me and myself in apartheid. So when I was let me take it back even further. When I was like a young teenager, my parents had really good friends from South Africa, white South Africans. So that was during the age of apartheid, okay? Because apartheid just was abolished fairly recently, right? And the family was over, and I still remember the little girl. Her name was Pamela, and she was a lot of fun. And the family, they were super fantastic. We had laughs and everything. And then they flew back to South Africa. And my mother says to us, she says, okay, that was great that they came to visit us. We need to go to South Africa to visit them. I remember looking at my mother and saying, Mom, that's not going to be a good trip. And my mother, who is a well-educated woman, but really wasn't thinking about it because she was just thinking, I'm going to go visit a friend. I said, Mom, it's South Africa. We can't go anywhere with them. Like, we can't go to restaurants together. We can't really do much together. It'll be the worst vacation ever. And she was like, that's right. Like, totally, because all she thought was, I'm taking a trip to see my friends. So anyways, it didn't happen. And that family actually moved from South Africa, moved to Australia, lived in Australia for a bit, missed their home because South Africa is still their home. They went back and then finally left for good. They said, we cannot live in a country that does this to its people. And they just left. So anyways, now fast forward, I'm a teenager actually I was a teenager in university, and I'm all gung ho because initially I was going to be a social worker and save the world. So I was that person, like peace, love, hippie girl. And so my first protests were all about apartheid. And it was all about, hey, hey, ho, ho, apartheid must go. Hey, hey, protesting in front of the South African consulate, the whole thing, right? So I almost felt invested in South African apartheid and abolishing it. So you can imagine how it hurt my soul when people started saying, Israel, the apartheid state, Israel, I was like, where have y'all been? How do you not know what it actually is? And you address it. So I'm going to flip it back to you and to really talk about, let's just tell people, this is apartheid. This is why people started saying Israel was an apartheid place. And how do you Jew Jitsu that?
Right. Well, I think that a lot of young people today who fall for that allegation, as you said, they're so far removed from apartheid South Africa and have not done the research. And so suddenly any kind of, injustice or perceived injustice, you just throw apartheid on there as the label. And it's the same thing with claims of genocide, right? Which we can talk about that later if you want.
We shall, yes.
But you take the most horrific label and put it on something, even if it doesn't match. And actually, that was even admitted by people in the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that, this does not actually match up with what apartheid was, but we're just going to call it that anyway.
Wow.
But, so I think a lot of people just don't actually know what that term is, what actually happened. And if you look, of course, at Israel, I mean, we have Arab judges on our Supreme Court. There are Arabs in our army. White apartheid South Africa would never have had Black Africans or any other person of color in their army, in their courts.
Exactly.
Never, let alone in the government. Same thing with the Jim Crow South here. It just never would have happened.
Never.
And so it's really insulting. Also, someone who is Black, my great grandparents left the Jim Crow South for California. To hear people equating Israel with Jim Crow America or South African apartheid it's just so diminishing to the experience of our ancestors, what they actually lived through. It's almost like this kind of insidious form of cultural appropriation. It's just gross.
It really is.
Yeah. And to hear that coming from the crowds that claim to be against cultural appropriation, but actually to be doing that with the worst things that have happened in humanity is just terrible and needs to be challenged more. But what I always say with this apartheid claim, is okay. First of all, there's bigotry in every country, right? So there are
Hmm.
people in Israel who treat Arabs terribly and things like that. I'm not saying there's no room for improvement, but that's in every country. But now let's look at
Absolutely.
how the Palestinians live in the neighborhood. In Lebanon, if you are Palestinian, you are not allowed to have a job. You're not allowed to buy property. You cannot be in the Lebanese government. You may have been
Hmm.
born and raised in Lebanon.
Hmm.
You may speak Lebanese Arabic,
Hmm.
but still that applies to you. You're not allowed to
Exactly.
have all these things. And it's not
Same in
just,
Jordan, is it
yeah.
not? Same in Jordan. Yeah.
Jordan, yeah.
So
Jordan,
they basically have camps. Like you
yeah.
basically have your like they ghettoize them. They put them in a shtetl, for the lack of a better term.
Right. And that's even a more interesting case because Jordan, when it had control of the West Bank, had given a lot of Palestinians citizenship, and
Mhm.
some to this day still have it. But then after they signed peace with Israel and relinquished all claims to the West Bank, many Palestinians actually had their Jordanian citizenship revoked and are left basically as stateless people.
Stateless. But that's Israel's
Yeah.
fault.
Right. And then, of course, in Syria and the civil war, the
Mhm.
Assad regime's bombings targeted Palestinian refugee camps, killed thousands, displaced thousands more, some of whom, if you want to call it lucky, were lucky enough to escape to Europe. Uh,
Mhm.
but there is no mention of any of this. People living in actual apartheid conditions,
Mhm.
and not just the Palestinians. In Syria, until really the outbreak of the civil war, the Kurds in the north, native to that land, were not allowed to speak their own language,
Mhm.
were not allowed to hold citizenship. In also Sudan, I mean, we know how Black Africans continue still to this day to be
Right.
treated there. In Mauritania,
Exactly.
and there's no outrage from anybody about any of this.
It's crickets. Just
Yeah,
silence.
there's no
Willful, just and it's willful.
right,
Just like it's willful,
right.
right?
So this is just another kind of gaslighting. I think of it as like every accusation is an admission. That's kind of how I've started to think about this. Um, and when you look at it as a case by case basis, I feel like you'll start to see, not you specifically
No.
necessarily, but people will
Yeah.
start to see that whether it's genocide, whether it's colonialism, any of these things, if you listen and think about it as they're admitting something, you will start to see a pattern.
Yeah, they're kind of they're to use a colloquialism, they're telling on themselves. You know,
Yeah.
yeah, they're telling on themselves. So, um, wow, it's a lot to process because I have to admit, some days I'm filled with hope. You know, I actually am, and then stuff happens, or you have that conversation, or I'll tell you, I went on this course, the shall go nameless, and it was a Jewish-based course, and it happened right after October 7th, so we're a little, tense to begin with, and it was meant to be conversations around the, Israel slash Palestine conflict and listening to narratives and sharing and this and that, and we're sitting there having a conversation in a group, and somebody said, let me see if I paraphrase this correctly. Basically, well, because Israel is an apartheid state, and this is a fellow Jew, and I could feel the heat bubbling inside of me. And I turned to him and I said, "What did you just say?" And he goes, "Well," I said, "First of all, absolutely not." And I actually said that to him. I said, "As a Black person, I am deeply offended that you would say that." I said, "You denigrate the actual experience of Black South Africans who lived through what actually was apartheid." I lost my shit. I lost my shit so hard that the moderator had to say, "Okay, okay, okay." I was livid.
Yeah.
Livid, because I felt like he slapped me too, and I was like, "Oh my god!" And that's when I lose a bit of hope because I'm like, "You're my people, man."
Yeah, yeah. That's something that I just also a feeling I share with some Jewish organizations. I think they're much more fringe, but where you'll have them saying things like that. And I'm like, these are supposed to be very well educated, progressive people who are in alliance with other marginalized communities, and for you to just so flippantly make statements like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. It's like,
Mm,
really?
right.
So, but now that I have this book, I'm going to learn how to do jujitsu the hell out of
I think we have to start taking the initiative more. This is something else I wanted to put in the book. We need to
Mhm.
not just wait on people to say this, but have our own events. If we're going to have an anti-settler event, something mourning the commemorating the Arab conquest, its effects
Mhm.
on different parts of the region. When you start to do things like that and initiate conversation, it's much more difficult for the other side to gaslight you or to challenge
Mhm.
you. And I think it's just so important that
Like
young,
putting the truth out there first is what you're
yeah,
essentially saying. You put it
mhm,
instead of hiding, put it out there. Say it da 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 da. You're right.
right, right,
Jujitsu.
yeah.
Oh, you don't gonna be saying that to people. Jujitsu. They'll be like, what? I said jujitsu, and I will hold up your book. All right. No,
And then they'll
I
buy a copy.
pardon me.
And then they'll buy a copy.
There you go. See, it's a win-win, isn't it? Okay. A more heavy topic because, of course, like you said, I do want to talk about it and I do want to hear your perspective on how we navigate that conversation around. I mean, conversation is probably not even the right word. Let's just say genocide
Hmm.
and throwing the Holocaust, flipping it around is, on us and all that stuff, like using one of our darkest times in history and accusing us of doing the same and all that stuff. So, well,
Right. This is so disturbing on two different but pretty obvious levels. The first, of course, is that we were victims of the Holocaust, of
mhm,
one of the biggest, most famous genocides in
mhm,
history, at least in recorded history. So to throw that word out there is both belittling the importance of the Holocaust, which they've been trying to do for many years anyway,
absolutely.
and also just evoking this pain in the community. But then on the other hand, this all began from their own genocidal attack on October 7th. And
Yep.
indeed, they have said we're going to keep doing it again and again and again. Not just them, Hezbollah, Iran, of course, all
Hmm.
these different groups supported by Iran. So this just goes back to what I was saying: if every accusation is an admission.
Hmm.
Where I get frustrated is people know this. I mean, it was in the media. I remember seeing it with that Hamas spokesperson say, "We will keep doing this
Hmm.
until there's nobody left, or until the Jews run away, either or, whichever comes first." He had said. CNN covered that. MSNBC even covered it. People know this, but
Uh-huh.
still ignore it and make demands on us. Forget about the threats to your life. Prioritize the group that actually is trying to kill you
Hmm.
and is holding their own civilians hostage. So this
Absolutely.
is what really makes me angry. Now, when it comes to the genocide claim, this is something that I actually have noticed before October 7th. It is used also flippantly. I mean, that with the Syrian civil war, as horrifying as it was, the term genocide was used, and I mean that's just not what it was. Now, in certain contexts, the ISIS genocide against Yazidis, sure, but Assad's brutal bombing of his own people, that was not a genocide; it was a war.
Hmm.
This was a civil war with different factions. There was no intent to wipe out a specific group.
And
Um,
there it is. And
yeah.
that's the piece. And that's the piece, in my limited way, that's the piece I say. I said, do you realize genocide is a systematic mission to wipe out a specific people?
Hmm. Right. And that's obviously not the goal of Israel.
Obviously.
If and I say this to people, and it might sound a little bit insensitive, but if Israel wanted to commit genocide against the Palestinians, it would have done so long ago.
Could have raised it to the
Right.
ground
It would have been finished.
decades ago. Decades ago. You
Yeah.
know, of course. Of course.
So this is just, I mean, I feel like academia, because you'll see, and I use the term in my book, scholarly anti-Semitism, because so
Yes, I
many of
saw.
these
Yeah.
people are academics.
Mhm.
Academia is becoming descholastified. You have activists taking over these spaces who use
Mhm.
these terms with a very specific meaning, and they use the terms in so many different ways that they lose that meaning. And so there's really no learning happening in most of these spaces or even institutions. It's just an indoctrination. And this is going to be a bigger challenge that we have to deal with. We
Mm,
know that some of it comes from funding from undemocratic regimes, Qatar,
right. Yes.
China.
Yeah.
And so that's going to present a much bigger challenge. But I think the first step for us is getting to acknowledging that this is a problem.
Mhm.
And how are we going to how are we going to carry on the fight from here? I think we have to really educate our youth who are preparing to go into these spaces. What is the kind of anti-Semitism you may, hopefully not, but that you probably will be facing? Because it, for the most part, is not going to be from the far right, where we've worried about it in different aspects, and you should still be prepared to deal with that. But this is something very different. We have to prepare our youth for how to deal with this challenge, so that they are
Mhm.
not intimidated or harassed or bullied, so that they feel they can be strong and proud and
Right.
not have to hide their identity, and so that they can speak the truth.
Mhm. You know, and it's interesting because when I think about what we get from the far right, in some ways, it's almost, I don't want to say manageable, but it almost is. You know what I mean? It's just so, like, if he's the person who calls me the N word, he calls me yeah, I know who you are. You
Mm,
know, from the other side and from the pseudo academics, it's a little different because it's more, I don't want to say shady, but it's more insidious, maybe. Like it's not as blatant,
mm,
right? It's just these subtleties or these nuances or these ways of couching the same sentiments, but in a way that isn't calling me the N word, like it is it's, to me, it's far more challenging to deal with, far more challenging than the
yes.
person who's wearing the white sheet. Right? It really is.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think it's like facing I'm trying to think of a good way of putting this. It's like if you are facing a wildfire versus if you're the frog in the pot as the temperature slowly is going up.
Ah,
Hmm.
yeah.
That's how I think of it. But the difference, I think, is there are more people who are ready to put the fire out than those who are aware of how quickly the pot's temperature is being
Is going
risen.
up. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Holy
So,
cow.
yeah, because we don't have as many people who are not even willing to challenge kind of this extremism on the left, but who even are aware of it. Whereas with
Hmm.
the fringe neo-Nazi kind, there's so many people that they come after immediately and target that are ready to come back.
Hmm.
I definitely think there is more of a sense of loneliness when dealing with kind of the far right, but I also think that slowly is starting to change with the far left. I'm sorry, I think that's
Yeah. No,
slowly.
I know what you meant. Yeah. But yeah. Yes. For our audience. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 I think that's slowly starting to change.
Wow. It's a lot. It's a lot. So what do you think? You touch on some strategies, and what takeaways do you have for our audience today? Because I think, you know, I deal with people on a regular who are really struggling, just like you said, are giving people the tools to manage this. They also talk about it's one thing to um it's one thing to give the tools to our young people who are in school, or people at the people in the public school system who are struggling with the same things. Um, And it's another thing. It's almost like a two-parter. It's another, how do we deal with people who aren't Jewish and kind of getting them to see? Like, so what do you think? What sort of strategies, if I may ask, do you think we could start to employ, or language that we can start to use, or, how do we Jew Jitsu both those things? Like, because they are different. They're different Jews versus non-Jews and allies, hopeful
Mhm.
allies.
Yeah, so something that kind of going a little bit off of the last point I was making with the slowly starting to change in regard to loneliness against the extreme on the left, is that they're not only stopping with the Jews either.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at that kind of anti-Semitism we see on the campuses, it's coming from two streams that are kind of merging into one. One side is the Islamist side, and the other is kind of more the communist Jew hatred.
Okay.
And I think that our potential for building allies and dealing with that is much more than a lot of people realize. There's a lot of some people don't see this yet, but there's also a lot
Uh,
of anti-Hindu sentiment emerging from this red-green alliance, like some people call it. Um,
really?
yeah, there's a lot of anti-Hindu sentiment. People are saying that, in particular, with the dispute over Kashmir, that India is a
I
settler
was going to
colony.
say, is this kind of like an offshoot of what happens there, even like India versus Pakistan and all that? Is that kind, or am I reaching?
It's more about yeah, kind of, but also more about the Kashmir dispute.
Wow.
And I mean, again, Islam arrived in that area historically by the use of force, but people
Mm-hmm.
are calling Indians settler
Mm-hmm.
colonizers in their own land. And
My
this isn't
God.
about being pro Modi or anti or any of that, but people are starting to come after them on that front. But there are also a lot of other groups, people from the former Soviet Union, people, from China or from
Mm-hmm.
other countries who have been under very radical left wing dictatorships, who see the similarities in the rhetoric used against Jews, in these spaces, and identify with it because it was something they had to live under, something they had to flee. And also, interestingly, is both the Islamist and also this far left kind of discourse now is turning more broadly, from anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism towards just being broadly anti-Western and anti-democratic. And even the actions they take with shutting down speech or discussions, reflects that. So the burning of American flags, the defacing of all these monuments and statues
And we're
recently.
having issues here too. Like it's like anti-Canadian sentiments, and yeah, we're seeing it here too.
Yeah. So this is a broader campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I do think, interestingly, that they are starting slowly to turn away from kind of the hiding under the covers anti Semitism into becoming more blatant, like what we have seen on the far right. So I think that the way to get to garner more recognition and to gain more allies with dealing with this is to point that out. They're not, it's the canary in the coal mine. Just as on the far right, they didn't stop with the Jews, with the Holocaust or the war. They're
Right.
not stopping here
That's
either.
true. That is true.
So I think that really strategies other than that, we have to also get better at telling our own story. And I think that, of course, the Holocaust is an important part of the story, but it's not the only part. And many, many well-respected Jewish organizations teach anti-Semitism as if it started with the Holocaust, and it very obviously did not. I mean, and it didn't end there either. So we have to talk more about, the pogroms, history, how Jews lived, even in what is now Israel, in the Middle East more broadly, under different, Islamic regimes and governments. We have to talk about what that is and what that means. What is the history of the Mizrahi Jews? What is the history of the Ethiopian Jews? There's not enough of discussion or education about these different communities
I
in our own.
agree. That's one thing I've been saying to people.
Mhm.
I said, we need to tell our own story. And because you're right, even when we tell our own story, it tends to be from one particular viewpoint. And I said, we've always done ourselves a disservice by not recognizing that and not sharing the stories of the Jews who have always lived in the Middle East and what they went through. Because we talk about, the Holocaust, we talk about the pogroms, but we don't talk about the hell the Jews in Arab lands went through.
Right.
We just don't talk about it. And we
Mhm.
need to, and we should have, not to say it would have changed hearts and minds, we don't know, but we need to anyways, even for our own community, to understand we are more than just one people,
Right.
right? Yeah, we've never been good at that. So do you feel hopeful? Or are we all going to run to Israel now?
I do. I feel hopeful. I'm an optimist, and at at the end of the day, I think also that hard times ultimately do create strong people, and we're living in very hard times, really
Oh,
around the world. But
oh my gosh.
yeah, so I do remain hopeful. I think that also a lot of people are waking up. I mean, I see videos from all over the world, Canada, Great Britain, the United States, other places, of people marching, even many who are not Jewish,
Mhm,
marching in support of Israel, marching against this anti-Western ideology and stuff, outraged about the extremism.
mhm.
Um, so I do see glimmers of hope. The same goes for the war itself. I mean,
'Cause there are times too, because obviously I've been watching it intently. Not as intently as my equal other who literally is like 24/7. Because I said to him, I said, I gotta clear my head every now and then." And I mean, in the beginning, I remember thinking, "Have we set our target, super high?" And you know what I mean? Like, eradicate Hamas. Like, have we set, I was like, "What are we gonna do? Is this gonna be another" you remember, what's that terminology? The war with no name, the endless war, Lebanon. Like, is this gonna be another one of where it just goes on and on and on? Like, I had all these worst case scenarios. And yeah, it's still not great, obviously. But I tend to agree with you. Like, we have made some huge strides. Get our people back. We have made some huge strides that have been pretty bloody incredible for a a small footprint of Israel. You know what I'm saying? Pretty freaking incredible. Like, Israel's accomplished what the quote unquote superpowers haven't managed to do in decades, right? Yeah, and it says a lot, but it is taking an emotional toll on those of us really super connected. But you
mhm.
know, oh my God, Dmitri, this is great. I could go on forever. Okay,
Yes.
we need to have a meetup at some point, in Israel.
Yeah.
Not that I don't want to go to the US of A, but Israel.
Yeah.
Even though I am curious about Philadelphia, because I actually didn't realize how large the Jewish community is in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
I kind of knew because I'd be like, oh, they'd be like, oh, I'm from Philadelphia. And finally I really slowly put it together and went, wait a minute, there's a really large community there. So one day I do have to make it to Philadelphia just to see for myself. But we do. We need to meet up and continue this conversation. I would like to hope that there would be no need. Well, some of it hopefully we'll be working on the right path towards it. And we can start that conversation, that future. What are we going to do moving forward conversation? I can't wait for that because that means that we've come out of it, right? We've come out
Right.
of this. So, so thank you. I'm so glad you joined me today.
Thank you. It was great.
Oh yeah, it was a lot of fun. Rivkush is hosted by me, Rivka Campbell. We're produced and edited by Michael Fraiman and the CJN Podcast Network. Our theme music is by Westside Gravy. If you like this episode, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. To support our work and everything else the CJN does, visit thecjn.ca/donate to make a monthly donation and receive a charitable tax receipt. Thanks for listening.
There's not that many news outlets that are covering Canadian Jewish arts these days, so we're really doing something unique. Hi, I'm Ilana Zakon.
And I'm David Sklar.
And we're the hosts of Culturally Jewish.
In these times right now of growing anti-Semitism, I think a lot of Jewish artists are feeling very isolated from their own arts communities.
You know, it's very isolating being in the arts world in Canada, and we get a chance to meet people from all over the country who are dealing with it in all sorts of different ways.
It also makes me feel more proud to be a Jewish artist right now. We would say there's no one out there who understands what we're going through, who feels the way we feel. Are we going crazy, right? Or is the world going crazy? And when we get together and we chat with these artists, we say we are not alone, that there are other people who are going through the same thing. And it actually makes me more proud to be a Jew and a Jewish artist.
To support our work and to keep up to date on everything that's happening at the Canadian Jewish News, visit thecjn.ca/donate.